So much of life today is ruled by the mighty boomers, but what about the food we savored? There's a massive divide between what they loved to feast on and what we do now, yet countless dishes today were born from the unforgettable classics of the 1970s boomer age. Alright, so we're starting strong with something that boomers can identify with right off the bat. A PoBoy Sandwich was a New Orleans specialty that spread across the entire nation throughout the 1970s. And that was because if you wanted to surpass your expectations for what a sandwich could do, you would get this one. Seriously, it was all the rage. This was basically the Subway footlong of the 90s, and for some pretty good reasons. The magic in this sandwich lies in that irreplaceable filling. It has the versatility to appeal to so many different kinds of tastes. Kids tend to favor your typical roast beef, chicken, turkey breast fillings, stuff like that. Some middle-aged people have more sophisticated tastes. They like going for fried shrimp or oysters. Usually, sandwiches pick a lane and stay in it, but the PoBoy Sandwich tried it all. It was a big part of the culture in Louisiana, and it was really popular in many restaurants as this recognizable piece of street food culture. Let's not stop there. The 70s were preceded by one historically bad string of events, like the war period and the economic recession. Both of those things gave birth to a new kind of cooking style known as mock food, and mock food would often have desserts that were no-bake desserts. They didn't need to be baked, or they didn't require your typical ingredients. Grasshopper Pie was a bit of a hybrid, because it was made with crème de cacao, whipped cream, and crème de menthe, which are definitely not your typical ingredients, but aren't really easily accessible either, and it did not need to be baked. It was a pie that treaded new flavors entirely. You wouldn't hear people use the words minty and refreshing for a pie, right? You just haven't had a grasshopper one, and in the 70s, this really got around. In the 1970s, it was one of the frontliners as far as frozen desserts were considered, and it worked even in warmer months too. The mint flavoring came from the crème de menthe, which gave it its iconic green hue too. One thing you can see in this dish is that it shows how the 70s had a preference for cooking with some style and flair. They didn't just want their dishes to taste good back then, they wanted it to look good too. Those two can stand on their own as main dishes, but what do we have for boomer side dishes? What made its way onto the salad bars, the appetizer sections, and the hors d'oeuvres of the boomer era? Stuff like Lima Beans are a pretty solid palace to start. They used to be featured in this meat and three-style meals which involved meat. That was a tradition that peaked in the 70s, and it basically let a customer pick any one kind of meat and pair it with side dishes, up to 3 at a time, hence the name. It was definitely more of a southern lunch thing. Lima beans were one of those sides that would often get paired with traditional food like casseroles or roast beef, or even pot roasts. It was a great and affordable side to work with, and it worked a little bit of healthy eating into your life too, all while costing just a few cents. Now I know my audience, and I know we've all grown up on 50 different flavors of cheese, from the finest imported wheels to the best local brands, but which of you really remembers Limburger Cheese? It definitely was something that only a boomer would remember, and its glory days were in the 70s when European immigrants brought it over in bulk, and it started making a name for itself. It wasn't at the front lines making names and stealing pages in cookbooks, but it was on top of every cheese platter, smothered between every sandwich, and served as a topping on many other dishes regularly. Limburger sounds German, right? You'd be right, because it does have German origins. In fact, it also has German ties as it was heavily marketed at communities with German-American populations, which were really common in the Midwest in that era. All right, I know these are all dishes that you can make at home and even make a whole day out of, but sometimes all you want is to pop open the garage, take your wife out for a night on the town, and have some comfort food. How did people do that in the 1970s? Well, in 1969, Cracker Barrel started making a name for itself in the South for providing comfort food of several different taste palettes. You had your meatloafs, you had fried chicken, you even had biscuits, all in a family-friendly, rustic environment that was oozing charisma and homeliness. It was hard to keep up with them, And it makes sense why Cracker Barrel managed to become such a popular food chain in that decade, as competitive as it was. It became a staple spot for family dinners and weekend plans. Maybe some of you guys have been there too. Try digging your memory. You'll probably find one at Cracker Barrel, and if you do, then definitely share it with us in the comments. So the next on our list is some Miracle Whip. And this magic spread was the key to making all your hunger vanish away in a gust of wind all the way back in 1969. Seriously, breakfast wasn't complete without this, and it became a staple of literally anything that involved mayo at all. It was a miracle-like spread that even used salads, and the reason it got so popular is because every mayo kind of tastes the same. You always have that strange tanginess with the sourness, but this one was a sweet mayo, and baby boomers grew up with it in their potato salads, their cold pasta, their sandwiches, and their pizza. It was definitely one of the most genre-defining products Kraft Heinz ever came out with, and people that were there for its time in the sun will remember that nothing really compares to the feeling of a Miracle Whip loaded mayo, bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwich. You may not be the biggest fan of main courses and savory, meaty, carb-filled dishes, so let's switch gears and talk about some boomer desserts that, in the time of the 1970s, they just could not go without. Aspics are definitely something that provided that much needed sugar rush to get through the explosive decade that was the 1990s, where it felt like the entire world was changing every Tuesday. Artistically, food-wise, and economically, it was a very volatile time. If there was any sense of calm, it was in dishes like this, which leaned into the convenient and easy nature of most of the recipes that became mainstay trends of the decade. People wanted easy food that didn't break their back to make, and aspics worked both as a personal one-on-one dessert and at a buffet-style gathering. Mrs. Dash Spice is an odd name, but don't worry, the kid from The Incredibles didn't finally get married. We're just talking about a salt-free seasoning blend that really made a name for itself back in the 1970s. See, Mrs. Dash was aimed specifically at one group that was making a lot more noise than any others. It was the health-conscious crowd, which had been raising hell all over America about how a growing fast food culture and an over-reliance on fatty meats and foods has ruined the general health of the American public. McDonald's tried to come out with fitness bands, burger joints started having salads, and companies started coming out with things like this to combat reputation-damaging accusations like that. Boomers definitely took to this seasoning well, especially since it was proven to be better for your heart than other seasoning mixes you could find at the time. One thing that was also really present in the 1970s for boomers and kids alike was a growing interest in the cuisines, culture, and diets of the broader world. Suddenly, Americans were really interested in every scent, flavor, spice mix, and recipe that came from beyond their borders. I'm talking about exploring the farthest reaches of Italian cuisine, picking up new tricks from Mediterranean cuisine, and trying out European dishes that they never had experimented with before. Meat pâtés were exactly like that for baby boomers that grew up being heavily influenced by French dishes like pâtés and techniques like mixing wine and flambeing the dish. These were continental recipes that made rounds in their home countries, and with a spin on them that modified them enough for the general American public, things like meat pâtés became fashionable appetizers. You would see them at dinner parties or have them with crackers. Some restaurants and places would even give it to you with toasted slices of baguette, which is a traditional French bread. Meat pâtés have a pretty strong flavor since they're usually made of liver, but it's always worth checking out this dish because it's a great source of protein and it tastes good enough to convert even the strongest white meat believer. In Australian, making your kids watch Popeye was one way to get them into eating spinach, or at least draw their attention towards it. But the thing that always kept them and others coming was creamed spinach. This became popular as a side being served at many steakhouses around the United States. It's pretty traditional to have some kind of vegetable-oriented side dish served alongside a steak, but it never really had enough steam behind it in terms of demand to warrant creamed spinach being its own standalone food experience. That is, until the dining landscape started violently changing throughout the 1970s. We just talked about how health consciousness became the new idea that was in, the topic of the week for the American public, and how suddenly everyone wanted to listen to experimental studies and research that was in its early stages but would end up being true later on. Talking about those of you that think gut health is a hoax, please eat a salad. Anyway, even better than a salad, and just as easy to make in your own home kitchen, creamed spinach was a very palatable and comfortable way to get introduced to vegetables as a source of fulfillment and not just a side dish. It was a rich, creamy dish that got a lot of use at family gatherings and as a weekly lunch. If you've never been catfished by food, let's break away from tradition and start right now, because egg creams are one very misleading plate of food. See, you would think you're about to experience some thick, rich, and creamy egg dish, but what you actually get is this dessert that's a little similar to eggnog. It's just made with seltzer water, chocolate syrup, and milk, but it became extremely popular in urban areas with middle-class boomers because it resembles soda fountain drinks. This was really true if you lived in New York, where a lot of people grew up on this, and it peaked in popularity during the post-World War II era. Right now, it's a bit of a nostalgic moment in time for baby boomers, and they still find comfort in grabbing U-Bet syrup and getting to work on a batch of egg creams. It wasn't like it was exclusive just to strictly gentrified and urban areas. The thing was simple enough that anybody could really make it and enjoy it. If you want to experience some fine dining, and I'm talking some proper rich people stuff, then there's no better main course than some Lobster Newberg. This dish brings you the best the ocean has to offer, and in coastal states, especially around the Pacific, it was all that baby boomers could eat or talk about. It became kind of a social thing, too. Got a new nice raise? Time for some Lobster Newberg. Hit it off with that girl you like? Boyfriend finally proposed? Having a kid? Got a new pet? Any reason was a good reason to have some. It was a rich dish that was made using lobster meat, butter, cream, cognac, and it was served on toast or in puff pastry. It also had sherry, and it was one of the symbols of fine dining in the 70s. It followed the interest that most people were having in continental cuisine, and depending on what neighborhood you were in, this was either one of the best meals you were going to have or a sign that America's bringing in new and better food. Some people had been used to eating stuff like this, but for others, it really was a treat they hadn't experienced, mostly because this is actually a French dish. But not everyone has the time, wallet, or even the desire for upscale restaurants, bougie dining, and poor portions that leave you wanting to order a pizza from Joe's or Larry's with wings. Some people need their fix of spices, chicken, sauces, all melded together for a full meal. That's where recipes like chicken marengo come in. Before we get into what the dish itself is, let's talk a bit about its backstory. It gets its name from the Battle of Marengo, which was fought by Napoleon in the year 1800. A lot of Napoleon's military exploits were famous enough to warrant food being named after him, so it's really no wonder. The next time you have this, you can bring that up as a fun fact to seem smarter at the table. Fast forward 170 years to 1970. And while nobody remembered the battle or Napoleon, the word marengo is something people use every day. Either they'll be ordering this for takeout or whipping up a few plates for themselves and the family. After all, it takes your basic ingredients like chicken, olive oil, and garlic and mixes it white wine or brandy to get an amazing dish that is both practical and stylish. We've had a surprising lack of pasta on this list so far, and that's just not something I can stand for. Let's change that with beefaroni, which was one of the best things a certain chef named Boyardee ever left us with. It came out in the 1960s, so the fact that it hit a milestone in popularity just 10 years later definitely speaks for the quality. Rest assured, I can testify too, this dish is worth your time, effort, and money. Boomers loved it for a reason, and that's because it fit into everything the era was trying to achieve. Good, convenient food that's easy to make, needs ingredients you probably already have, and can work for an entire group or a single person depending on how you make it. It also helped a lot that TV culture was booming around the time this came out, so a lot of boomers grew up having beefaroni while watching their favorite Tuesday TV show. It typically was made with elbow macaroni, ground beef, and tomato sauce with cheese, so you might be getting images of an offshoot of lasagna. Best not to confuse this, though, because beefaroni stands on its own 2 feet as a dish that'll rock your world. Angel Delight is something we can thank our mates down in Great Britain for, because the first immigrants that came to America ended up bringing it over. Angel Delight sounds like a cheap dollar store snack, but it's this rich dessert that uses a powdered mix with milk to make a really light, airy whipped dessert. The powdered mix would come in all sorts of flavors like butterscotch, strawberry, and even chocolate. Kids all around the country loved it, and it was a great and easy way to have a palate cleanser on hand. Sometimes you need a rush of sugar, but you can't afford a whole cake or spare the time to get into a day of baking, which I've always found to be an acquired taste as far as hobbies go. Boomers loved Angel Delight because it created that middle ground between both options and made their weekly glucose rush a lot more accessible. Easy to make desserts like this, Jell-O and pudding mixes were one of the trademarks of the convenience-driven food culture of the 1970s, which saw a lot of stuff like this come out to fit in with the new lifestyle Americans were finding for themselves. Namely, eating and watching TV, which had become a major part of everyone's day as almost every household started having a TV set up, and then came refrigeration advancements, and then came things like microwaves, slow cookers, etc. You get the picture. Basically, cooking had never been as fast or easy as it was in the 70s, and it's only gotten much easier ever since comparatively. Hey, Koi! With everybody trying their hand at making America's comfort food more healthier, Coca-Cola decided to put its hat in the race too with Tab Soda. Before the days of Diet Coke, we had this, which was launched in 1963 for the very first time. It was their first ever diet soda, and they were trying hard to make this the next big thing. It was targeted towards women especially because of the promise of it being significantly lower in calories, but it was overall marketed as a more weight-conscious version of the famous cola everyone's come to love. Still, soda is soda. It'll never be as good for you as water, even if it's made with better ingredients and less calories. It was lighter on the sugar, so that helped sell the image that it was going in a different direction from normal Coke as well. Baby boomers became real health freaks over the time, but the quirky pink can helped it get out there in terms of advertising. Everyone can remember cans of pink Tab soda lining up the shelves at grocery stores, though most people who were born after its heyday wouldn't remember it at all. People probably still think Coke Zero is the first diet soda they ever put out. You take all the best parts of a mousse, the creaminess, the texture, the softness, the way it melts in your mouth and takes you back to better days, and you pair that with all the goodness of salmon. Salmon is easily one of the best proteins you can ever target your hands on, and it's definitely one of the best things to ever come out of the ocean. Salmon Moose, then, is understandably something that has the potential to be a national hit. That's exactly what it ended up being too, because ever since it started hitting restaurant menus in the 1970s, the Salmon Moose Express started, and it did not stop for anybody. Boomers loved it because it was so easy to make it in advance, and it was perfect for gatherings that were casual in spirit but a little more elegant. You know, when you like to dress up with your friends, eat a little fancier, feel good, that kind of stuff. It was a chilled appetizer made with cream cheese, gelatin, and pureed salmon, so it was easy to get the ingredients, and everyone loved every bite of it. Crepe Susette were one of the new things that we got from the French, and it was this really elegant dish with a lot of showmanship. That meant it was the pride and joy of home chefs everywhere because it was one of those dishes that felt like a flex if you made it, both to you and everyone else in the room too. It used caramelized sugar, butter, zest, and Grand Marnier, and you would have to flambe it tableside. So even watching somebody prepare this felt like a whole show right before your meal. The dish itself was supposedly made by an assistant waiter known as Henri Charpentier, who was making food for King Edward VII at the time, but he happened to set the thing on fire by accident. Guess God has funny ways of handing out good luck because instead of ruining it, the dish ended up tasting better. The rest, as they say, is history. You might be thinking why something like this got popular in the 70s, though, which so far has been marked by its love of easygoing food. That's because everyone likes to pull out all the stops once in a while and show people what they've really got going on. Every premium French restaurant in New York had this on their menu, so naturally it was embraced with very open arms by baby boomers, who couldn't wait to try everything else in the world too. Stepping away from the French and going a bit more back towards our patriotic roots, let's take a long, hard look at rice-a-roni next. Okay? So I know I said we're stepping away from the foreign influence, but don't shoot the messenger. Rice-a-roni was the work of an Italian immigrant named Domenica de Domenico, who was based in San Francisco. However, the story goes that her idea wasn't the original, and it was actually her neighbor that showed her an American rice pilaf recipe, mixing vermicelli noodles and sautéing it in butter with rice, cooking it in a broth. Domenica smelled good food, but saw a fat paycheck first, and she immediately decided to commercialize the dish. That was the start of what would eventually be released as rice-a-roni in 1958, and the packaged version took grocery stores by storm. It was known as the San Francisco Treat, and it was one of the first few examples of ready-made food that came in a box. Nobody had the hindsight to see it back then, but you could call it one of the ancestors of the packaged food we enjoy today. So let's go to an eggplant-based dish that a lot of people didn't really give much love to towards the start of the 2000s. I'm definitely talking about eggplant parmesan, which is this southern Italian dish that became really popular in the 1970s thanks to Italian immigrants making a lot of culinary culture from the motherland popular. It was an extremely vegetable-heavy dish, and that gave it the momentum it needed to succeed in an America that was desperately looking for more greens in its food. Boomers in particular grew up when this dish was first being introduced to menus for many restaurants across the nation. It meant that people for once were exploring more than just the typical side of Italian culture. This is actually a dish that became popular in Naples, but in America, it involves coating the eggplant in flour, frying it until it's golden, and then serving it dipped with marinara sauce and cheese. This makes a really good Italian-American comfort food that's hard to beat. The reason this worked so well in particular is because it has all the basic preparation that most American comfort foods do: breadcrumbs, deep frying, a lot of cheese, the usual. It also manages to still not compromise on how healthy it is to gain flavor, which is why it was the Italian poster boy of the vegetarian movement in the 70s. Now, how do you mix healthy eating with satisfying your sweet tooth? Kind of feels like both of them are permanently at odds, but they don't really have to be. An example is Vonetta ice cream cake, a frozen dessert that became a bit of a status symbol as well as a wildly popular premium ice cream cake. It had the appearance, flavor, and presentation all going for it, which meant that just at first glance you could tell this wasn't any ordinary ice cream cake from the parlor. One of the finest parts of that presentation was the layered structure. Vonetta ice cream cakes have these dreamy, thin, wavy layers of vanilla or chocolate ice cream spread throughout the crispy, chocolatey layers of the cake itself. It looks like one long, delectable loaf. It was kind of meant to look like something that would automatically make you hungry, something that looked easy to eat, as if it were inviting you to. It's made of vanilla ice cream typically, with chocolate compound or sauces, but other flavors can work too. The best mix is the original chocolate vanilla one though, because it creates a classic contrast of flavors that just bring out this cake's full potential. Some call it a luxury dessert that isn't meant for everyday use, but that couldn't be further from the truth. When it did hit America, the goal for this cake was commercialization. So despite how premium it seemed and how it felt like you were having this luxury desert experience, Vonetta cakes were readily available. That helped them become the pop culture icon they are today. Chipped beef on a toast was something that got popular because of World War times. It wormed its way into American diets during the time when rationing was still how everyone was living. Making lunch out of potato skins and reusing bacon grease as much as possible was popular. It was also one really typical meal for soldiers involved in the war, and that's because it took nothing to make but ticked a lot of boxes when it came to health. You had beef, so you were getting some protein in. You had it on toast, so you had your carbs, which meant you had energy. The sauce was a white bechamel sauce, which might seem fancy if you think about the military, but contrary to popular belief, they also do like seasoning their food with sauces and flavor. It stuck way longer than after the war ended though, and it became a household dish in the Midwest and South during the 1960s and 1970s. Over there, people really believed in keeping it simple. The French and the Italian intricacies of the world weren't really for them. No, a Southerner believed in red meat and carbs. A happy life was always going to make some mix of the two, and if it was affordable and easy to make, then you knew you had a dish worth writing down in the diary. Chipped beef was just like that, since it was sold in jars and it was available in most pantries. James Dole was somebody who founded the Hawaiian Pineapple Company in 1901. It was a company that specialized in one thing above all else, and that was getting you accessible, premium quality canned pineapples. This company would eventually hold recipe contests to promote the canned stuff it was selling, and many of the submissions were actually pretty genius uses of pineapple. You might be thinking what this has to do with the next dish, but keep your seatbelt on, I'm getting there. The 1925 contest was one where everybody kept submitting their own take on a particular cake known as the pineapple upside-down cake. When the company saw its massive popularity, it knew that its product had become cemented into the social fabric of American life. Everyone was buying canned pineapples, and it put winning recipes in advertisements, which helped this dish skyrocket in popularity. Skip 50 years later with this same momentum, and you have upside-down cakes being a part of the recipe books of home chefs across the country. It's made with pineapple rings with a cherry in the middle. Once you layer it all up and bake it, you just have to invert it, and what you get is a heavenly mix of buttery caramel and tangy pineapple with a cake hidden underneath all that Hawaiian goodness. Pineapple upside-down cake is still a very noteworthy dish that holds its own against anything the modern era has to throw at it, and the presentation helps a lot. The cake was something that let people feel like skilled bakers, while at the same time enjoying a cake made of extremely accessible ingredients and a new flavor they weren't used to having in cakes. Now, this is going to start with another tangent whose purpose will be clearer down the line, but stay with me. Biscuit was made in 1931 by Carl Smith, right? He was this big-shot General Mills sales executive, and the idea came to him when he asked a dining car chef how they made biscuits as good as they did so quickly. The chef told him that he had this pre-made mix ready for batches of cookies, and it had all the ingredients he needed: flour, baking powder, shortening. It's kind of like how we freeze our post-workout meals today and eat them when we need them, but on a much bigger scale. This let him make batches of 24 in a matter of minutes, since all he really needed to do was just the baking. When Smith came back to General Mills, the story stuck with him, and he worked hard to make a shelf version of the idea, one that could be commercialized and put out for profit. This is how biscuit was made, and this is how the favorite pancakes of boomers everywhere started dominating the industry. People found out that the pre-made mix is actually good for more than just making biscuits. The format is the real key here, the idea of getting the hard work out of the way so you can immediately get to the baking. People asked themselves, what's the best thing to incorporate that into? And the answer was literally right under their noses as they ate breakfast. It was pancakes. They were already extremely easy to make, so why not take it even further? General Mills was marketing the life out of biscuit anyway, and ads and cookbooks had recipes for things like dumplings and cakes as well. All kinds of toppings shined when used with the mix, so naturally, it became a breakfast option that almost everyone has leaned on at some point, and it tasted pretty amazing for a mass-produced, ready-made mix. Soy loaf is a great place to end this list because it summarizes most of the stuff that the boomer generation in the 70s was known for when it comes to eating habits. It basically started off as this copy of tofu and tempeh from East Asian cultures, but when it came to the West in the early 1900s, people started to see it as more. Suddenly, soy loaf was this easy protein and carb fix that was a great substitute for animal products. In the 1970s, when plant-based eating started really taking off in the States, and veganism as an ideology and lifestyle was making its place, it skyrocketed in popularity because there was a lot of interest in soy-based products. The reason was that soy-based stuff had a lot less of an impact on the environment, and it also could work as an alternative to meatloafs and casseroles and other dishes that Americans just can't go without. I mean, have you really heard of a boomer household that doesn't survive on meatloafs? Kind of feels like talking about a fish that lives without water. Soy loaf was meant to mimic things like that, and Americans were pretty used to mock food already. You might be wondering how it even manages to do this, though, and it's because of something called textured vegetable protein and soy flour, which, with the help of a lot of binders and seasonings, actually comes extremely close to the sensation and flavor of real meat. It was pretty transparent about this stuff, too. So whenever you went to places like health food stores, you would always have soy loaf stacked shelves. Now that's some interesting food that boomers from the 70s loved. What are some of your favorites from this era? Let us know, and don't forget to like and subscribe.